The Floor Above by M L Humphreys. September 17th, 1922. I sat down to breakfast this morning with a good appetite. The heat seemed over, and a cool wind blew in from my garden, where chrysanthemums were already budding. The sunshine streamed into the room and fell pleasantly on Mrs. O'Brien's broad face as she brought in the eggs and coffee. For a supposedly lonely old bachelor, the world seemed to me a pretty good place. I was buttering my third set of waffles when the housekeeper again appeared, this time with the mail. I glanced carelessly at the 3 or 4 letters beside my plate. One of them bore a strangely familiar handwriting. I gazed at it a minute, and then I seized it with a beating heart, and tears almost came into my eyes. There was no doubt about it at all. It was Arthur Barker's handwriting. Shaky, changed, to be sure, but 10 years have passed since I have seen Arthur, or rather, since his mysterious disappearance. For 10 years, I have not had a word from him. His people know no more than I what has become of him, and long ago we gave him up for dead. He vanished without leaving a trace behind him, and it seemed to me too that with him vanished, so too did the lost shreds of my youth. Arthur was my dearest friend in that happy time. We were boon companions, and many a mad prank we played together. And now, after 10 years of silence, Arthur was writing to me. The envelope was marked Baltimore, almost reluctantly, for I feared what it might contain. I passed my finger under the flap, and I opened it. It held a single sheet of paper torn from a pad. But it was Arthur's writing. Dear Tom, old man, can you run down to see me for a few days? I'm afraid I'm in a bad way. Arthur. Scrawled across the bottom was the address, 536N Marathon Street. I have often visited Baltimore, but I cannot recall a street of that name. Of course I shall go, but what a strange letter, after 10 years. There is something almost uncanny about it. I shall go tomorrow evening. I cannot possibly go off before then. September 18th. I am leaving tonight. Mrs. O'Brien has packed my 2 suitcases and everything is in readiness for my departure. 10 minutes ago I handed her the keys and she went off tearfully. She has been sniffling all day and I have been perplexed, for a curious thing occurred this morning. It was about Arthur's letter. Yesterday, when I had finished reading it, I took it to my desk and placed it in a small compartment together with other personal papers. I remember distinctly that it was on top, with a lavender card from my sister directly underneath. This morning I went to get it. It was gone. There was the lavender card exactly where I had seen it, but Arthur's letter had completely disappeared. I turned everything upside down. I called Mrs. O'Brien, and we both searched, but in vain. Mrs. O'Brien, in spite of all I could say, took it upon herself to feel that I suspected her, but what could have become of it? Fortunately, I remembered the address. September 19th. I have arrived. I have seen Arthur. Even now he is in the next room, and I am supposed to be preparing for bed, but something tells me I shall not sleep a wink this night. I am strangely wrought up. Though there is not the shadow of an excuse for my excitement, I should be rejoicing to have my friend again. And yet, I reached Baltimore this morning at 11 o'clock. The day was warm and beautiful, and I loitered outside the station a few minutes before calling a taxi. The driver seemed well acquainted with the street I gave him, and we rolled off across the bridge. As I drew near my destination, I began to feel anxious, afraid. But the ride lasted longer than I expected. Marathon Street seemed to be located in the suburbs of the city. At last we turned into a dusty street, paved only in patches and lined with linden and aspen trees. The fallen leaves crunched beneath the tires. The September sun beat down with a white intensity. The taxi drew up before a house in the middle of a block that boasted not more than 6 dwellings. On each side of the house was a vacant lot, and it was set far back at the end of a long, narrow yard, crowded with trees. I paid the driver, I opened the gate, and I went in. The trees were so thick that not until I was halfway up the path did I get a good view of the house. It was 3 stories high, built of brick in fairly good repair, but lonely and deserted looking. The blinds were closed in all of the windows, with the exception of 2, one on the first, one on the second floor. Not a sign of life anywhere, not a cat, not a milk bottle to break the monotony of leaves that carpeted the porch. But overcoming my feeling of uneasiness, I resolutely set my suitcases on the porch, caught at the old-fashioned bell, and gave an energetic jerk. A startling peal jangled through the silence, and I waited there. But there was no answer. After a minute, I rang again. Then, from the interior, I heard a queer dragging sound, as if someone was coming slowly down the hall. The knob was turned, and the door opened. I saw before me an old woman, wrinkled, withered, filmy-eyed, who leaned on a crutch. "Does Mr. Barker live here?" I asked. She nodded, staring at me in a curious way, but made no move to invite me in. "Well, I've come to see him," I said. "I'm a friend of his. He sent this to me. He sent for me." At that, she drew slightly aside. "He's upstairs," she said in a cracked voice that was little more than a whisper. "I can't show you up. I haven't been up a stair now in 10 years. "That's all right," I replied, and seizing my suitcases, I strode down the long hall. "At the head of the steps," came the whispering voice behind me. "The door at the end of the hall." I climbed the cold, dark stairway, passed along the short hall at the top, stood before a closed door. I knocked. "Come in." It was Arthur's voice, and yet not his. I opened the door, and I saw Arthur sitting on a couch, his shoulders hunched over, his eyes raised to mine. After all, 10 years had not changed him so much. As I remembered him, he was of medium height, inclined to be stout and ruddy-faced, with keen grey eyes. He was still stout, but had lost his colour, and his eyes had dulled. "And where have you been all this time?" I demanded when the first greetings were over. "Here," he answered. "In this house?" "Yes." "But why didn't you let us hear from you?" He seemed to be making an effort to speak. What did it matter? I didn't suppose anyone cared. Perhaps it was my imagination, but I could not get rid of the thought that Arthur's eyes, fixed tenaciously upon my face, were trying to tell me something quite different from what his lips said. I felt chilled. Although the blinds were open, the room was almost darkened by the branches of the trees that pressed against the window. Arthur had not given me his hand, had seemed troubled to know how to make me welcome. Yet of one thing I was certain: he needed me, and he wanted me to know he needed me. As I took a chair, I glanced about the room. It was a typical lodging house room. Medium-sized, flowered wallpaper, worn matting, nondescript rugs, a washstand in one corner, a chiffonier in another, a table in the centre, 2 or 3 chairs, and a couch which evidently served Arthur as a bed. But it was cold, strangely cold for such a warm day. Arthur's eyes had wandered uneasily to my suitcases. He made an effort to drag himself to his feet. "Your room is back here," he said, with a motion of his thumb. "No, wait," I protested. "Let's talk about yourself first. What's wrong?" I've been sick. Haven't you a doctor? If not, I'll get one. At this, he started up with the first sign of animation he had shown. No, Tom, don't do it. Doctors can't help me now. Besides, I hate them. I'm afraid of them. His voice trailed away, and I took pity on his agitation. I decided to let the question of doctors drop. For the moment. As you say, I assented carelessly. Without more ado, I followed him into my room, which adjoined his and was furnished in much the same fashion. But there were 2 windows, one on each side, looking out on the vacant lot. Consequently, there was more light, for which I was thankful. In a far corner, I noticed a door, heavily bolted. There's one more room, said Arthur as I deposited my belongings, one that you'll like, but we'll have to go through the bathroom. Groping our way through the musty bathroom, in which a tiny jet of gas was flickering, we stepped into a large, almost luxurious chamber. It was a library, well furnished, carpeted, and surrounded by shelves fairly bulging with books, but for the chilliness and bad light, it was perfect. As I moved about, Arthur followed me with his eyes. There are some rare works on botany. I'd already discovered them, a set of books that would have given much to own. I could not contain my joy. You won't be so bored browsing around in here. In spite of my preoccupation, I pricked up my ears at that. In that monotonous voice, there was no sympathy with my joy. It was cold and tired. When I had satisfied my curiosity, we returned to the front room, and Arthur flung himself, or rather fell, upon the couch. It was nearly 5 o'clock and quite dark. As I lighted the gas, I heard a sound below as of somebody thumping on the wall. That's the old woman, Arthur explained. She cooks my meals, but she's too lame to bring them up. He made a feeble attempt at rising, but I saw he was worn out. Don't you stir, I warned him. I'll bring up your food tonight. To my surprise, I found the dinner appetizing and well cooked, and in spite of the fact that I did not like the looks of the old woman, I ate with relish. Arthur barely touched a few spoonfuls of soup to his lips and absently crumbled some bread in his plate. Directly I had carried off the dishes, he wrapped his reddish-brown dressing gown about him, stretched out at full length on the couch, and asked me to turn out the gas. When I had complied with his request, I again heard his weak voice, asking if I had everything I needed. Everything, I assured him, and there was unbroken silence. I went to my room, finally closed the door, and here I am, sitting restlessly between the 2 back windows that look out on those vacant lots. I have unpacked my clothes. I have turned down the bed, but I cannot make up my mind to retire. If the truth be told, I hate to put out the light. There is something disturbing in the way the dry leaves tap on the panes. My heart is sad when I think of Arthur. I have found an old friend, but he is no longer my old friend. Why does he fix his pale eye so strangely on my face? What does he wish to tell me? But these are morbid thoughts. I will put them out of my head. I will go to bed and get a good night's rest, and tomorrow I will wake up finding everything right and as it should be. September 26th. I have been here a week today, and have settled down to this queer existence as if I had never known another. The day after my arrival, I discovered that the 3rd volume of the botanical series was done in Latin, which I have set myself the task of translating. It is absorbing work, and when I have buried myself in one of the deep chairs by the library table, the hours fly fast. For health's sake, I force myself to walk a few miles every day. I have tried to prevail on Arthur to do likewise, but he, who used to be so active, now refuses to budge from the house. No wonder he is literally blue, for he is. It is a fact that his complexion and the shadows about his eyes and temples are decidedly blue. What does he do with himself all day? Whenever I enter his room, he is lying on the couch, a book beside him which he never reads. He does not seem to suffer pain, for he never complains. After several ineffectual attempts to get medical aid for him, I have given up mentioning the subject of doctor. I feel that his trouble is more mental than it is physical. September 28th. A rainy day. It has been coming down in floods since dawn, and I got a queer turn this afternoon. As I could not get out from my walk, I spent the morning staging a general house cleaning. It was time. Dust and dirt everywhere. The bathroom, which has no windows and is lighted by gas, was fairly overrun with water bugs and roaches. Of course, I did not penetrate Arthur's room, but I heard no sound from him as I swept and dusted. I made a good dinner and settled down in the library, feeling quite cosy. The rain came down steadily, and it had grown so cold, I decided to make a fire later on. But once I had gathered my tablets and notebooks about me, I forgot the cold. I remember I was on the subject of the Astrotrifolium, a rare variety seldom found in this country. Turning a page, I came upon a specimen of this very variety, dried, pressed flat, and pasted to the margin. Above it, in Arthur's handwriting, I read, September 27th, 1912. I was bending close to examine it when I felt a vague fear. It seemed to me that someone was in the room. Someone was watching me. Yet I had not heard the door open nor seen anyone enter. I turned sharply, and I saw Arthur, wrapped in his reddish-brown dressing gown, standing at my very elbow. He was smiling. He was smiling for the first time since my arrival, and his dull eyes were bright, but I did not like that smile. In spite of myself, I jerked away from him. He pointed at the aster. It grew in the front yard under a linden tree. I found it yesterday. Yesterday, I shouted, my nerves on edge. Good Lord, man! Look! It was 10 years ago. The smile faded from his face. 10 years ago, he repeated thickly. 10 years ago. Five o'clock. Dusk is falling. Oh God, what has come over me? Am I the same man that went out of this house 3 hours ago? And what has happened? I had a splendid walk. I was striding homeward in a fine glow, but as I turned the corner and came in sight of the house, it was as if I looked at death itself. I could hardly drag myself up the stairs, and when I peered into the shadowy chamber and saw the man hunched up on the couch with his eyes fixed intently on my face, I could have screamed like a woman. I wanted to fly, to rush out into the clear cold air and run, to run and never come back, but I controlled myself, forced my feet to carry me to my room. There is a weight of hopelessness at my heart. The darkness is advancing, swallowing up everything, but I have not the will to light the gas. Now there is a flicker in the front room. I am a fool. I must pull myself together. Arthur is lighting up, and downstairs I can hear the thumping that announces dinner. It is a queer thought that comes to me now, but it is odd I have not noticed it before. We are about to sit down to our evening meal. Arthur will eat practically nothing, for he has no appetite, yet he remains stout. It cannot be healthy fat, but even at that it seems to me that a man who eats as little as he does would become a living skeleton. October 5th. Positively, I must see a doctor about myself, or soon I shall be a nervous wreck. I am acting like a child. Last night I lost all control, and I played the coward. I had gone to bed early, tired out from a hard day's work. It was raining again, and as I lay in bed, I watched the little rivulets trickling down the panes, lulled by the sighing of the wind among the leaves. I fell asleep. I awoke, how long afterward I cannot say, to feel a cold hand laid on my arm. For a moment I lay paralyzed with terror. I would have cried aloud, but I had no voice. At last I managed to sit up to shake the hand off. I reached for the matches, and I lighted the gas, and it was Arthur who stood by my bed. Arthur wrapped in his eternal reddish-brown dressing gown. He was excited. His blue face had a yellow tinge. His eyes gleamed in the light. "Listen," he whispered. I listened, but I heard nothing. "Don't you hear it?" He gasped, and he pointed upwards. Upstairs?" I stammered. Is there somebody upstairs?" I strained my ears, and at last I fancied I could hear a fugitive sound, like the light tapping of footsteps. "It must be somebody walking about up there," I suggested. "No!" he cried in a sharp, rasping voice. "No, it is nobody walking about up there." And he fled into his room. For a long time I lay trembling, afraid to move, but at last, fearing for Arthur, I got up and I crept to his door. He was lying on the couch with his face in the moonlight, apparently asleep. October 6th. I had a talk with Arthur today. Yesterday I could not bring myself to speak of the previous night's happening, but all of this nonsense must be cleared away. We were in the library. A fire was burning in the grate, and Arthur had his feet on the fender. The slippers he wears are as objectionable to me as his dressing gown. They are felt slippers, old and worn, frayed around the edges as if they had been gnawed by rats. I cannot imagine why he does not get a new pair. "Stay, old man," I began abruptly. "Do you own this house?" He nodded. "Don't you rent any of it?" "Downstairs. To Mrs. Harlan." "But upstairs?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it's inconvenient. There's only a peculiar way to get upstairs." I was struck by this. "By Jove, you're right. Where's the staircase?" He looked me full in the eyes. "Don't you remember seeing a bolted door in the corner of your room?" "The staircase runs from that door." I did remember it, and somehow the memory made me uncomfortable. I said no more and decided not to refer to what had happened that night. It occurred to me, as I did, that Arthur might have been walking in his sleep. October 8th. When I went for my walk on Tuesday, I dropped in and saw Dr. Lorraine, who is an old friend. He expressed some surprise at my rundown condition and wrote me a prescription. I am planning to go home next week. How pleasant it will be to walk in my garden and listen to Mrs. O'Brien singing in the kitchen. October 9th. Perhaps I had better postpone my trip. I casually mentioned it to Arthur this morning, and He was lying relaxed on the sofa, but when I spoke of leaving, he sat up straight as a bolt, his eyes fairly blazed. "No, Tom, don't go!" There was terror in his voice and such pleading that it wrung my heart. "You've stood it alone here 10 years, I protested. "And now—" "It's not that," he said, "but if you go, you will never come back." "Is that all the faith you have in me?" "I have faith, Tom. But if you go, you'll never come back." I decided that I must humour the vagaries of a sick man. "All right," I agreed. "I'll not go. Anyway, not for some time." October 12th. What is it that hangs over this house like a cloud? For I can no longer deny that there is something indescribably oppressive. It seems to pervade the whole neighbourhood. Are all the houses on this block vacant? If not, why do I never see children playing in the street? Why are passers-by so rare? And why, when from the front window I do catch a glimpse of one, is he hastening away as fast as possible? I am feeling blue again. I know that I need a change, and this morning I told Arthur definitely that I was going. To my surprise, he made no objection. In fact, he murmured a word of assent and smiled. He smiled as he smiled in the library that morning when he pointed at the Aster trifolium, and I don't like that smile. Anyway, it is settled. I shall go next week, Thursday the 19th. October 13th. I had a strange dream last night. Or was it a dream? It was so vivid. All day long I have been seeing it over and over again. In my dream, I thought that I was lying there in my bed. The moon was shining brightly into the room so that each piece of furniture stood out distinctly. The bureau is so placed that when I am lying on my back with my head high on the pillow, I can see full into the mirror. I thought I was lying in this manner and staring into the mirror, and in this way I saw the bolted door in the far corner of the room. I tried to keep my mind off it, to think of something else, but it drew my eyes like a magnet. It seemed to me that someone was in the room. A vague figure that I could not recognize. It approached the door and caught at the bolts. It dragged at them and struggled, but in vain. They would not give way. This figure, it turned and showed me its agonized face, and it was Arthur. I recognized his reddish-brown dressing gown. I sat up in bed and cried to him, but he was gone. I ran to his room, and there he was, stretched out in the moonlight, asleep. It must have been a dream. October 15th. We are having Indian summer weather now, almost oppressively warm. I've been wandering about all day, unable to settle down to anything. This morning, I felt so lonesome that when I took the breakfast dishes down, I tried to strike up a conversation with Mrs. Holland. Hitherto, I have found her as solemn and uncommunicative as the Sphinx, but as she took the tray from my hands, her wrinkles broke into the semblance of a smile. Positively at that moment it seemed to me that she resembled Arthur. Was it her smile or the expression of her eyes? Has she also something to tell me? "Don't you get lonesome here?" I asked her sympathetically. She shook her head. "No, sir. I'm used to it now. I couldn't stand it anywhere else. And do you expect to go on living here the rest of your life? It may not be very long, sir. Her words were simple enough, but the way she looked at me when she uttered them seemed to give them a double meaning. She hobbled away, and I went upstairs and wrote Mrs. O'Brien to expect me early on the morning of the 19th. October 18th, 10 a.m. I'm catching the 12 o'clock train tonight. Thank God I had the resolution to get away. I believe another week of this life would drive me mad, and perhaps Arthur is right. Perhaps I shall never come back. I ask myself if I have become such a weakling as that, to desert him when he needs me most. I don't know. I don't recognize myself any longer. But of course, I'll be back. There's the translation, for one thing, which is coming along famously. I can never forgive myself for dropping it at the most vital point. As for Arthur, when I return, I intend to give in to him no longer. I will make myself master here, and I will cure him against his will. Fresh air, change of scene, a good doctor, these are the things he needs. But what is his malady? Is it the influence of this house that has fallen on him like a blight? One might imagine so, since it's having the same effect on me. Yes, I have reached that point where I no longer sleep. At night I lie awake and I try to keep my eyes off the mirror across the room, but in the end I always find myself staring into it. I always find myself watching the door with the heavy bolts. I long to rise from the bed and draw back the bolts, but I'm afraid. How slowly the day goes by. The night will never come. 9 p.m. I've packed my suitcases and put the room in order. Arthur must be asleep. I'm afraid the parting from him will be painful. I shall leave here at 11 o'clock in order to give myself plenty of time. It is beginning to rain. October 19th. At last it has come. I am mad. I knew it. I felt it creeping on me all the time. Have I not lived in this house a month? Have I not seen? To have seen what I have seen, to have lived for a month as I have lived, one must be mad. It was 10 o'clock. I was waiting impatiently for that last hour to pass. I had seated myself in a rocking chair by the bed, my suitcases beside me, my back to the mirror. The rain no longer fell. I must have dozed off. But all at once I was wide awake, my heart beating furiously. Something had touched me. I leapt to my feet, and as I turned sharply, my eyes fell upon the mirror. In it I saw the door, just as I had seen it the other night, and the figure fumbling with the bolt. I wheeled around, but there was nothing there. I told myself I was dreaming again, that Arthur was asleep in his bed, but I trembled as I opened the door of his room and peered in. The room was empty. The bed not even crumpled. Lighting a match, I groped my way through the bathroom into the library. The moon had come from under a cloud and was pouring in a silvery flood through the windows, but Arthur was not there. I stumbled back into my room. The moon was there too, and the door. The door in the corner was half open. The bolt had been drawn. In the darkness I could just make out a flight of steps that wound upward. I could no longer hesitate. Striking another match, I climbed the back stairway. When I reached the top, I found myself in total darkness, for the blinds were tightly closed. Realizing that the room was probably a duplicate of the one below, I felt along the wall until I came to the gas jet. For a moment the flame flickered, then burned, bright and clear. Oh God, what was it I saw? A table thick with dust and something wrapped in a reddish-brown dressing gown that sat with its elbows propped upon it. How long had it been sitting there, that it had grown more dry than the dust upon the table? For how many thousands of days and nights had the flesh rotted from that grinning skull? In its bony fingers it still clutched a pencil. In front of it lay a sheet of scratched paper, yellow with age. With trembling fingers I brushed away the dust. It was dated October 19th, 1912. It read, "Dear Tom, old man, can you run down to see me for a few days? I'm afraid I'm in a bad way." I like that one.
Read about the author at the bottom.
M L Humphreys appears to be one of the many obscure writers who worked briefly in the pulps, or perhaps the name is a pseudonym used once and discarded. Nothing could be found about this author beyond the fact that this story, the only one with this byline, was selected by Providence, Rhode Island's premier Celine Dion impersonator H.P. Lovecraft in 1929 and 1930, when he compiled a list of significant horror stories incorporating both literary fiction and popular stories. The list was published as H.P. Lovecraft's favourite weird tales, the roots of modern horror, and the criterion for being included was that the stories must have the greatest amount of truly cosmic horror and macabre convincingness. Now, I cannot stand Lovecraft the man. I enjoy some of his fiction, but even I will freely admit macabre convincingness is one hell of a phrase. The narrator for this, by the way, for Pseudopod, is a friend of ours. Dave Robertson is an avid literary and sonic alchemist who pursues a wide range of creative explorations. A brainstormer, keeper of the buttery man voice, patent pending. Pattern seeker, dream weaver, and eternal optimist, Dave's efforts to boost the awesomeness of the world can be found at the Round Table podcast, the Vex Mosaic e-zine, and through his creative studio, Wonder Thing. Dave is the creator of Archivos, an online story development and presentation app, as well as the curator of the Palathos Patreon feed, where he explores the fantasy megacity, one street at a time. Dave is one of the nicest people I've ever met.
He and Kareem are very good friends.
Yes, they are. The joke about H.P. Lovecraft being a Celine Dion impersonator is me being very cruel.
Is you being Ryan Reynolds.
Yes. Lovecraft, or as we know him now, Mark Zuckerberg, has a very long face. Has a long face. And
he's just making it up.
I'm just fucking with him, basically.
Yeah. What you gonna do about it, Lovecraft? Huh?
Still not touching. Still, you can't see me.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Dave is a very accomplished narrator. He's quite good. He has some really good stuff.
He's effortlessly good.
You don't know if it's effortless.
He's effortlessly good.
He's good. We go. He's very talented. He words good. He speaks words good. I don't believe he writes, but yeah, Dave's a good guy. So
just
Wendy's
all, and that's going in the freezer overnight so we can sleep.
Make sure all the stairways in the house tonight have the door closed and bolted in front of them.
Yes.
Or you'll find out that, your dear friend who wrote you a letter 10 years ago is actually dead up in the attic. And I love that so little is explained.
I know, right? Just what is he? What is it? Is it just like an echo? Is the area tainted in some way? It's just so many ways that you could take that. I really like it.
I'm just not going to dwell too much on it because it gets a little... Our stairs have no door. Oh, Wendy!
Wendy.
Oh, no. Okay, you need a tripwire. You need the Santa Claus trap. You need a tripwire and a tin can or something this evening.
Yeah, Rubesco, I'm right there with you. And along that note, if you want to see Lovecraftian cosmic horror done extremely well, anything by Premi Mohammed is a really good place to start.
Or Cassandra Khaw.
Or Cassandra Khaw. Or any one of a legion of people that Lovecraft would have recoiled in horror from, that now do horror better than he does.
Yes, it's glorious, isn't it?
Yes.
Shall we take a quick break?
Let's take a quick break and have a Welsh cake.
Okay, we will have a Welsh cake. Why don't you push the button that says be right back? But first tell everybody we'll be right back.
We'll be right back.